This is an EWTN Newslink. I'm Teresa Tomeo from Catholic Connection. Millions in the path of severe weather as a monster spring storm marches across parts of the country. A severe storm system sweeping across the South and Midwest and states such as Arkansas, Missouri, and Illinois, reporting devastating tornadoes. As the bad weather moves northeast, so does the risk of tornadoes, especially in Indiana, Kentucky, and Ohio. And the Vatican Secretary of State Cardinal Pietro Parolin celebrating a memorial mass yesterday, marking the 20th anniversary of the death of Pope St. John Paul II. In his homily, the Cardinal said the transparency of his life before God was the foundation of his fearless witness to the truth, his unyielding defense of human dignity, and his tireless proclamation of the gospel. For more news with a Catholic perspective, visit EWTNnews.com. I'm Teresa Tomeo, and Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders starts now.
What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic?
Why can't women become priests?
1-833-288-EWTN.
I don't understand why I have to earn salvation.
1-833-288-3986.
What's stopping?
Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
What's stopping you? This is Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hey everybody, welcome again to Call to Communion here on EWTN on this Thursday afternoon. Glad you could join us. This is the program for our non-Catholic brothers and sisters. Those of you who have questions about the Catholic faith, but golly, maybe you don't know a Catholic or you don't know anybody in the Catholic faith that could answer that question for you. Well, that's why we're here. Here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Outside North America, please dial 1 and then 205-271-2985. You can also text the letters EWTN to 58177. Wait for our response and then text us your first name and your brief question. Message and data rates may apply. You can also send us an email if you would prefer that. The address ctc@ewtn.com. I mean, if you want to spell it out, you can. Call to communion at ewtn.com or ctc@ewtn.com. Pedro Quiles, our producer. Matt Gabinski, our phone screener. Rich Jesse handling social media. If you'd like to ask a question via YouTube or Facebook, we're streaming on both those platforms right now. Just put your question in the comments box, if you would, please. I'm Tom Price, along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
What? I'm doing great. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing decent.
Interesting question here from Dave. Oh, I beg your pardon. Pete. Pete says, I have heard that cremation is permissible for a Catholic as long as there isn't a superstitious reason for it. I'm leaning towards cremation, mainly because of the cost, but partly that the idea of my body lying 6 feet underground kind of creeps me out. My ashes being buried wouldn't bother me as much. Is this superstitious or am I just weird? Love, Pete.
Okay, so to prefer cremation because it's more affordable is clearly not superstitious. To be creeped out at the idea of being entombed strikes me as a fairly intuitive response, right? I mean, like, I'm creeped out of the idea of being worm food. I don't think any of us like that idea.
No.
Now, the idea that cremation is going to somehow mitigate some sort of post-mortem discomfort, I think, is misplaced because you're not going to feel comfort or discomfort in the body.
That's right.
When you're not in the body, when you're separated from the body and anticipating the resurrection. Now, trust me, the other side of the grave, the last thing in the world you're going to be worrying about is the state of your decaying flesh. Yeah. For one reason or another, you're not going to be worrying about that problem, right? But I don't think I wouldn't call that superstitious, just so much as almost a kind of just sort of an instinctive, imaginative reaction. Now, that's not the kind of thing that's in view. The sort of things that would be in view would be like, say, if you held to a notion of the transmigration of souls or something like that, or you felt like by scattering your ashes over the over the Rocky Mountains, that your spirit would somehow be, diffused into the land. Or, this kind of New Agey sort of thing. That's what's in view when they say a superstitious reason.
I don't think Pete is alone in, looking at cost. I think we all.
No, I think that's a major factor.
And I've also noticed that over the last, 10, 15 years, more and more churches and cathedrals have established columbariums.
Yes, indeed.
I can think of 2 right here in town.
I can too. I can too.
So there you go. Here's a question now from Don, who says, Dr. Anders, with the given that God, being outside of time, knows the future and consequences of human decisions, what do you think is the reason he delayed so long in blessing Abraham with a child? So long, in fact, that Sarah lost her patience or faith in having a part of this herself and gave Abraham her servant Hagar. Note that Hagar and Ishmael are considered as the beginning of the line that became Islam, which I'm sure you know.
Right. So from the point of view of the New Testament, the point of delaying Abraham's fatherhood is to test his faith and to prove that God can, as it were, raise up children from this withered stump.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there you go. And Don, thank you so much for your email. We have time for another. This is from Tom. No, it's not from Tom. It's from, I can't quite make this out, so we'll call it anonymous. Dr. Anders, as I continue to read my way toward the Catholic Church, I recently came across the catechetical lectures of St. Cyril of Jerusalem. I'm asking to ask you if you know of any pitfalls in them I must watch out for, such as subsequent censoring, etc. I find their clarity helpful and fresh, and because they're so ancient, they kind of scratch an itch, to quote one of your phrases, to see what the early church taught as further evidence that she is indeed trustworthy for me today. Many thanks to you and Tom.
Yeah, well, the catechetical lectures are absolutely acceptable. I mean, he's a doctor of the church, and so that makes him a sure guide to Catholic catechesis and Catholic thought. And just, because somebody's a doctor of the church doesn't mean that absolutely everything they say is infallibly true, and you're allowed to read texts in the tradition with a sort of critical eye. But no, you're absolutely safe reading these and have at them and enjoy them.
Absolutely. And we'll go to break with this one from Mark. Does James 1, verse 4, prove that Sola Scriptura is incorrect?
I think there are lots of things that prove that Sola Scriptura is incorrect. I don't necessarily think that James 1, let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking in anything. I don't think that has any bearing on the question whatsoever at all. I just don't think that's about the question of the basis of our profession or religious knowledge or religious epistemology or any of the issues at stake in the authority question, I don't think, are in view in James's epistle.
Well, there you go. Mark, thanks so much for your email. If you would like to send us an email for a future show, here is the address, ctc@ewtn.com, ctc@ewtn.com. We do enjoy reading these emails, and we look at all of them that come in. Certainly can't answer every email that come in. I think there's, Pedro, you have to help me out on this. There's a couple of hundred emails that are still in the mailbag, so we can't do them all, but we do as many as we can. We try to tackle a few on each of our live shows, and then once a month dip a little bit deeper into the mailbag for as many as we can do in an hour or so. So again, the address, ctc@ewtn.com. However, from this point forward, not as concerned with emails as we are with your phone calls. Here's the number, 833-288-EWTN, if you have a question for Dr. David Anders. 833-288-3986. Call to communion on this Thursday afternoon here on EWTN.
EWTN Radio is all over social media. All your favorite programs are available right now, on demand for you to listen or download. Check us out on SoundCloud. Look for EWTN Radio. Remember, EWTN is everywhere.
How many times have you heard the complaint that the church is boring? Well, the problem is not that church is boring. It's that we are bored. We are the problem. We've lost our childlike sense of wonder. G.K. Chesterton says the children have abounding vitality, and yet they want things repeated. and unchanged. They always say, "Do it again," and the grown-up person does it until he's nearly dead. For grown-up people are not strong enough to exult in monotony, but perhaps God is strong enough to exult in monotony. It's possible that God says every morning, "Do it again" to the sun, and every evening, "Do it again" to the moon.
Spend more time with the Apostle of Common Sense. Visit chesterton.org for more information and go to EWTNRC.com to discover more books and programs written and inspired by G.K. Chesterton.
This is Bishop Robert Barron. Join us as we discuss the truth, goodness, and beauty of Catholicism on the Word on Fire show, Sunday afternoon, 4 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio.
Live truth, live Catholic.
This is EWTN Radio.
It's Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders here on EWTN. Love to talk with you today. Our phone number 833-288-EWTN. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, maybe you'd like to explain to us what is stopping you from becoming a Catholic. 833-288-3986. You know, with news from EWTN's Vatican Bureau, you can now watch all of the important events from Rome, even if you don't have TV access. Using the latest technology, we have made it possible to watch the latest news from the Holy See, all delivered to your home via EWTN's live streams. How about that? Watch live on EWTN's YouTube channel. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Well, we have a follow-up here. David, this is, you remember yesterday we read a question from Sean regarding soteriology.
Yes.
And he continues by saying, well, yesterday on the program, Dr. Anders kind of skirted around the issue without actually answering my question. He goes on to say, I'm at a complete loss to understand why there's no authoritative Catholic text currently available on this crucial issue. Apologists speak and write at great length about the papacy, purgatory, Mary, etc. But when it comes to justification, the most important issue of all, since it's determining whether or not we'll be saved, they have almost nothing to offer. I've been trying to find a clear explanation of the Catholic teaching on soteriology for more than 50 years. Still can't find one. And again, that's from our friend Sean.
Okay, thanks, Sean. Appreciate the question. So yesterday, the question that I answered on the air had specifically to do with the doctrine of the atonement, and you didn't bring justification into it, right, at that time, right? So now you've broadened the scope of the question to be, you're not limiting it to justification or atonement, but to the whole scope of Catholic soteriology, right? Mm-hmm. And first of all, I would just beg to differ that there are no authoritative statements on soteriology. I think that's just patently false. So the sixth session of the Council of Trent, for example, is all about the Catholic doctrine of justification and soteriology, right? Probably about 2/3 of the polemical treatises penned by St. Augustine of Hippo are at one level or another about soteriology. And to be sure, all of his anti-Pelagian works are all about soteriology, not the least of which in importance would be On the Spirit and the Letter, De Spiritu et Littera. The Catechism of the Catholic Church speaks at length about soteriology, and I'm staring right now actually at Part 1, Article 3, he was conceived by the power of the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary. Paragraph 1, why did the Word become flesh? And it answers that with reference to the doctrine of redemption, right? If you want like an academic treatise discussing the doctrines of redemption and atonement, there are a couple that I would point you to. One of them, from an Eastern point of view, Eastern Catholic point of view, you might look at the book by Khaled Anatolios, Deification Through the Cross, an Eastern Christian Theology of Salvation. And Father Anatolios is a priest of the Melkite Rite, which is a Catholic Eastern Rite church. He's also a professor of theology at Notre Dame. You might look at the work by the Catholic theologian and lay philosopher Eleanor Stump, which is simply titled Atonement, Oxford University Press, 2019, and a sort of magisterial treatment of Christology by Thomas Joseph White, the Incarnate Lord, and then his sort of summary of Christian doctrine in the light of Christ, which has sections on soteriology and atonement in particular.
Okay.
So, I mean, I could do more. We could go on, all right? And many of the sort of great manuals of the 19th century that present the dogmas of the Catholic faith, like Ludwig Ott, this sort of thing. Of course, they're going to have detailed sections on soteriology, on the incarnation, on atonement, on justification, and so forth. So, I kind of sort of dispute the characterization that there's no authoritative statements. Now, here's one thing I will concede to you.
Okay.
That it's not as frequent a topic of conversation and theological reflection as you might expect, right? And I grew up in Protestant land, and in Protestant land, it's like everything converges on the doctrine of justification. This, for the Protestant, of course, the legend that ascribes to Luther the phrase that this is the doctrine on which the church stands or falls, really does, whether Luther actually said that or not, it captures, I think, a lot in the Protestant imagination. And maybe the underemphasis on explicating that doctrine in the Catholic tradition that you have picked up on, and I would agree that it's not as explicitly discussed and as frequently discussed as it is in Protestant circles, goes to challenge the fundamental assumption that this is the doctrine on which the church stands or falls, right? And one of the things I think is evident when you study Catholic history is that the church and the Christian life from the Catholic point of view begins as a lived and participatory experience of God's saving grace before and preeminently over it becoming a theory of encountering God and His grace, right? And I mentioned kind of casually and with some humor C.S. Lewis's remark that people would continue to be nourished by food even if the theory of vitamins fell apart. And that's the way Lewis approaches the doctrine of the atonement, that there are theories that theologians have put forward to explain how the thing works, but the important thing is to get Christ into your soul, right? And then how the thing actually works on your soul at the theoretical level is a secondary object. And the focus of Catholic life and practice has principally been on getting Christ into the soul and worrying about how the thing functions after the effect, and not so much on having a theoretical account of it, but and I think very, very much so. That's the way, say, in Eastern theology is often characterizes itself that way, as being so very practical and spiritually and mystically oriented. Andrew Luth, who's not a Catholic theologian, he's an Orthodox theologian and historian who, in his book on the origins of Christian mysticism, makes this point quite explicitly, that in antiquity there was very little distance between what we might call spiritual theology and dogmatic theology. Yeah. Today we tend to bifurcate those in two different directions, and he says, his position is that dogmatic theology emerged as a kind of abstract statement of what began as interior religious experience. The encounter with Christ as God precedes the doctrine of Christ as God.
Of course.
And I think there's a lot of truth in that.
Okay, very good. And Sean, thanks so much for your follow-up email. Hope you can use those resources. And, of course, you can always check the podcast if you want to go back and write those down. The address is EWTN.com/radio, and then click on the words Podcast Central, because those are all in alphabetical order. Just scroll down a little bit and you'll see Called to Communion. Hey, we'd love to talk with you this afternoon at 833-288-EWTN. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, 833-288-3986. Here's an email from George. My theology professor states that the dogma on the Assumption of Mary was peripheral to the faith and not necessary. Is he a heretic?
Okay, so look, there is a position that is allowable in Catholic theology called inopportunism. Inopportunism. And I'm not saying that one should be an inopportunist, but let me articulate the stance. And classically, Newman took this position on the declarations of the First Vatican Council regarding papal infallibility. So papal infallibility is a dogma, meaning all Catholics are bound to believe it. Yeah. And it was defined in the First Vatican Council. Newman, being a faithful Catholic, said, I believe the dogma. I think that it is factually true. I think that it was wrong to state it dogmatically. I think it was inopportune to do so. Now, you might say, well, how can that be? If it's true, then why shouldn't we dogmatically define it? The list of true things that you shouldn't define is nigh unto infinite. Oh, yeah. Right? When your great aunt comes and asks you to tell her truthfully what you really think about her new hat.
Oh, boy.
Right? Is it really prudent to answer the question?
Danger.
In every case.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And look, whether Newman was right or wrong, there is no doubt that the definition of the dogma of papal infallibility proved a stumbling block to unity for many people, not the least of which were the Orthodox, as well as a fair number of dissenters at the council itself. Now, some of them, flipped immediately, argued vociferously against the dogma, and then when it got defined, they joyfully proclaimed it as loyal sons of the Church. Others were not so sanguine and ended up leaving Catholic unity in consequence. Was it worth the cost? I mean, you could make this judgment. Yeah, of course it was absolutely worth it because it was true, et cetera, et cetera. But, I mean, you can see how intelligibly people of good will could disagree on whether the definition of a dogma was opportune or not.
Sure.
Was it opportune to define the dogma of the Assumption? Well, I mean, I think you could bring arguments forward either way, right? But this is all academic because it's been defined. It's been defined. So if you're a practicing Catholic, the debate is closed. It's a dogma. You accept it. It's like I said, we could sit in a history classroom is exactly the place to discuss whether it's prudent to have defined, but that ship has sailed, buddy.
Yep.
That ship has sailed.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, George, for your email. We're going to go to a call. Well, let me give you the phone numbers first. 833-288-EWTN if you have a question for Dr. David Anders. 833-288-3986. Let's pick up a call now that we received overnight on the EWTN listener comment line.
My name is Oliver, and I'm from Virginia. Just wanted to know that when the soul separates from the earthly body, the soul is biblically, it says you're present with the Lord for judgment. But once you pass the judgment as a soul, when you pass that juncture, whether you go to purgatory or whether you end up in heaven, beatific vision and see God, is your soul going to connect only when the end time, your physical body like Jesus had when he walked around after he was resurrected? So my question is that when does the body and the soul reunite? And is that pending that you don't go to hell?
Okay. Yeah, thanks. Appreciate the question. So according to Catholic doctrine, soul and body reunite at the end of time when Christ comes back at the second coming, the resurrection of the dead. And, of course, it's not limited to the elect. So the damned also get bodies back. Everybody gets a body, and then they get judged in the body.
Well, there you go. Thanks so much for your call. Call to communion here on EWTN. Here's a question now from Matt. And he says, I recently heard the claim that because the Second Council of Constantinople declared anyone anathema who did not worship God in the form of the Trinity, and Nostra Aetate from Vatican II says that the Church holds Muslims in esteem because they adore the one God, although certainly not the Trinity. Then that is a contradiction of councils which we as Catholics consider to be infallible. How do we reconcile these two seemingly contradictory positions?
Yeah, so the anathema is an ecclesiastical penalty that applies to Catholics.
Okay.
Right. So anathemas don't apply to people who aren't Catholic.
Okay.
You can't subject someone to ecclesiastical penalty if they're not within ecclesiastical jurisdiction.
Okay. Well, that's
and look, the way you interpret councils and papal statements and all this kind of thing, you have to look at them within the context in which they're promulgated.
Okay.
And you don't read them the way a fundamentalist reads the Bible, for example. And so to take a similar controversy, which would be, kind of the big kahuna on the Second Vatican Council is the question of, outside the church, no salvation. That's very similar to what you're raising.
Yeah.
And the hardline position is to say, hey, the church said no salvation outside the church, and now the church says you can be saved if you're outside the church, and isn't that a contradiction? And I go back and I look at where the doctrine came from, and you find it articulated in St. Cyprian of Carthage in the 250s, and he applies it in particular to the case of the Novatianists, who were kind of hardline Puritan types that said that they alone were the Catholic Church, and the mainline Catholic Church was not the Catholic Church because they weren't sufficiently pure and holy. And so the position that's actually being anathematized is a kind of more restrictive version of Catholicism in contradiction to a view that's kind of a bigger tent view. And so if you want to translate that kind of internal dynamic to the modern period, you actually take that the Catholic view is the more broad-minded one, and the narrow people who want to restrict salvation to their own sect, they're actually the people who've put themselves outside the church.
Well, yeah.
So it sort of flips the thing on its head. Right?
Yep.
And when you bring those kind of historical considerations into play, and you allow those to help color your interpretation of the tradition, and you're guided, of course, here by the magisterium, I think you're in pretty safe ground.
Okay. Appreciate that. Thanks so much for your email. Lines are open for you at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986 for Call to Communion. Here's a question from Wilson. If the prayer of St. Gertrude releases 1,000 souls from purgatory each time it's said, why isn't it being prayed around the clock?
Yeah, thanks. Well, so first of all, whenever you encounter a private revelation,
yes,
that is in support of a private devotion, you must interpret that in a way that is consistent with the dogmatic magisterial teaching of the Church. Okay. And so it's the Church's dogmas and the magisterium that define how we approach the tradition, not private revelations and private devotions. Okay. The one interprets the other. And there is absolutely nothing in Catholic tradition dogmatically and authoritatively that would lead us to conclude that salvation is such a mechanical and magical affair that it could be achieved simply by churning formulaic prayers. Right? And that's the way you're asking the question.
Right,
why don't we just set up a prayer chain of 1 million Catholics that pray this thing, every 30 seconds for 2 years, and then we will have effectively emptied purgatory because we can extrapolate like the lifetime population of the earth, right? That is so far removed from the spirit of Catholic devotion to Christ and what holiness consists in, that I think whatever the revelation purports, we can't read it that way. We can't live it that way in the context of Catholic experience.
Wilson, thanks so much for your email. Still time for your phone call at 833-288-EWTN. Calls are coming in right now, but there's room for you. 833-288-3986.
The month of April holds special significance for Catholics. It's devoted to Jesus in the Holy Eucharist. During this month, we are invited to reflect on the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. St. Padre Pio said, "Always remain close to the Catholic Church, because it alone can give you true peace, since it alone possesses Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament, the true Prince of Peace." Join in this devotion to the Holy Eucharist with books, DVDs, sterling silver medals, rosaries, crucifixes, and more. Available at EWTNRC.com. That's EWTNRC.com.
This is a digital moment with Sandra McDevitt. Did you know King David once questioned why God made flies and spiders? Tradition tells us when fleeing from King Saul, David snuck into the cave where the king was sleeping. He stole the king's sword to prove he meant the king no harm. The sleeping Saul rolled over and pinned David. Fortunately, a fly bit Saul, causing him to move, and David escaped. When King Saul was pursuing David once again, David hid in a cave. A spider immediately spun an elaborate web over the entrance to the cave. When the king's pursuers arrived, they saw the unbroken web covering the entrance and thought the cave empty. David realized all of God's creatures had a purpose. I'm Sandra McDevitt for EWTN Radio.
Tomorrow on More to Life, the life you were meant to live.
We'll look at how the theology of the body can help you live a more abundant life.
That's tomorrow on More to Life, 10 a.m. Eastern, 9 Central on EWTN Radio.
Now back to Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders.
It's Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders on this Thursday afternoon here on EWTN. Love to talk with you today about what's on your mind regarding the Catholic faith. 833 288-EWTN. A special shout out to all of those of you who are not Catholic. Maybe you're some other religion, maybe you're no religion at all, but you've got a question or two about the Catholic faith. That is why we are here. 833-288-3986. All right, if you are listening to us in East Central Texas, your EWTN radio station needs to hear from you next week. The great Armor of God Catholic Radio airing their Spring Pledge Drive. That'll be starting on Tuesday of next week. So if you're listening in Temple, Texas, or Cameron, or Kepner, or anywhere, please remember to support your Catholic radio station. Here is Joe now in Georgia listening to us on The Quest. Hello, George. What's on your mind today, sir? Joe, are you there?
Oh, yes.
Go right.
I
Yeah.
said Joe, excuse me.
Go right
real quick
ahead.
question for you about sin and forgiveness. I'm a lifelong Catholic. I know about forgiveness of sin, confession, etc. My question is this. I can say my morning prayers and other things. I mean that with respect. Ask for guidance and help on not sinning today, and yet I find myself day after day repeating the same sin, whether it be taking the Lord's name in vain, bad-mouthing my neighbor, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know if I'm addicted to these sins or if when I say I'm sorry, repent, say the appropriate psalms for forgiveness and pray to God, am I forgiven? Or is it, hey, you've committed it so many times, look, I'm getting tired of this. You need to do more than just say you're sorry, and I'm not going to forgive you till you do.
Okay, thanks. I really appreciate the question, and it's one that I think almost everybody can relate to, right? So first of all, yes, you're forgiven. The only requirement for genuine forgiveness of sins in the context of the confessional is imperfect contrition, just the recognition that this was wrong and I ought not to have done that. And I'd rather not do it again if it can be helped. If you have that, you've got sufficient contrition to be absolved of your sin. Now, here's my experience personally. It's taken me a long time to come to this. So this is like me now departing from official Catholicdom into my own private musings. Okay, so you take it with a grain of salt. It took me a long time to figure out exactly and I'm still working on this, by the way, like what is the extent of my own freedom of cooperation with grace, and how is that best exercised? And I grew up in a fundamentalist community that was big on the Calvinist doctrine of total depravity and real big on like, oh, woe is me, poor me, I'm a miserable sinner and I can't do anything. Oh, God, oh, God, oh, God, oh, God, oh, God. And I kind of got into a dynamic of like sort of castigating myself in prayer. And it was really almost a kind of form of like verbal self-abuse, like, oh, I'm a terrible person and I'm a horrible guy and oh, God, have mercy on me. And it became almost a sort of reflexive action. And I had to become Catholic and think about it for a long time to realize that sort of behavior was never designed to improve my character. Like it seemed to be. It had this sort of illusion of wisdom because it had this sort of mark of humility about it. But I think at the end of the day, it really isn't. I think it's it's just sort of a glorified form of self-abuse, and it's not really helping me in any way. And it led to a kind of neurotic internal condition and probably a kind of an unfair view of God and His mercy. And I began to realize that like I needed to take more agency over my own spiritual condition, and that cooperation with grace had to mean more than simply, say, showing up in the confessional and going to Mass and repeating the constant admonition to God, cure me of this wound of sin in me, right? That there had to be something more from my initiative. And what's helped me in this is sometimes it's even outside the domain of Catholic theology, when I've like dipped into the psychological literature and this kind of thing, or the recovery literature, and like if you go to an AA meeting, they'll tell you stay away from the things that make you fall.
Sure.
Like if you walk down this street and your favorite bar is on that street and that's a stumbling block, don't go down that street, right? And that the things that I could start taking responsibility for in my life were, were there systems that I could put in place that would essentially prevent occasions of sin from arising, which would require me to think strategically ahead of time. When things were going well for me and I didn't feel temptation, I'd have to sort of lay out, okay, what are the things that lead me to stumble and fall? And when does this happen? What time of day? And where am I? And who am I talking to? And that I can sort of start constructing a rule of life for myself that would facilitate good habit making. And if you read the habit forming literature, what you learn is that neurologically speaking, you can never get rid of a bad habit. What you can do is you can replace a bad habit with a good one. Right. But again, that takes some strategic thinking. You have to think about, okay, what are the particular triggers? What are the particular behaviors that those evoke in me? What is the sort of reward state that's in view when I do that kind of thing? How can I plan to institute a new behavior in response to the same trigger and seek in search of the same reward? And those things are highly individualistic. I mean, every person's very, very different there.
Sure.
But to really start thinking about it, my behavior, really strategically at that point. So I give you a trivial example from my own life, or maybe not so trivial as it may be. I can say things and get myself in trouble. Like if I'm in the heat of an argument with a family member, for example. And more and more and more, I'm coming to realize that the way around that problem is to shut up. Right? Rather than, in the past, I would have felt okay, I'm going to form a resolution. And my resolution is don't go there. Don't let yourself go there. Don't say that thing that made everybody mad last time, right? And then we'd get into the heat of the argument, and then I'd say the thing. And I'm coming, that's never going to work for me, right? Because the trigger is always there. The conversation is there. And the habitual response is always going to be, say the thing I shouldn't say, right? And, I guess the reward state was the sense of vindication, and it comes at tremendous personal cost.
Sure, it does.
And so what I've kind of arrived at is just don't talk. Just don't talk. Be okay with being thought wrong. And that was a huge brain shift for me. I wasn't going to beat the problem through willpower. Willpower is actually, and the social scientists will tell you, it's a vanishingly thin resource. It wears out really fast. Instead, you have to start thinking about what are the systems to put in place that will prevent the problem arising in the first place. In my case, it was shut up. That's rule of life number 1, shut up.
Okay.
That prevents the problem from arising, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Joe, is that helpful for you?
That is. I got a quick follow-up.
Yeah.
What about forgiveness between confessions? I mean, if I could, but I don't go to confession every day.
Right. Well, it would be kind of obsessive to go to confession every day. It would really impede your life. So first of all, I don't know your situation, but I mean, my suspicion is you probably don't need to go to confession every day, and maybe you're tilting a little bit to the scrupulous side if you think you do, and that's something independently to work on. Am I scrupulous? Right? Am I overly sensitive conscience? Right? That's something to address. But, I mean, the church teaches that if I have perfect contrition, which is that I'm sincerely sorry for having offended God because I want to be in relationship with Him, that's sufficient to atone for sin and restore my fellowship with God. Now, it's not sufficient. It's not sufficient for me to lawfully go to communion. I still have to go to confession.
Yeah.
But, most parishes have confession on Saturdays, and it might be less convenient to go during the week, especially if you're at work, right? And so let's say you sin grievously on Monday. Well, you form the resolution to go to confession on Saturday. You make an act of perfect contrition. You make a firm purpose of amendment, and then you put your mind at ease until Saturday, right? Now, there's a trap you can fall into, and I would warn you against the trap. Here's the trap. Well, I've got between now and Saturday to do this sin as many times as I want to, right?
Yeah.
And don't do that. Don't do that.
Yeah, don't do that.
Right? Be conscious of that and don't do that one, right? But make a firm purpose of amendment, make an act of contrition, be sorry for sins, make the resolution to go to confession on Saturday, and you're fine.
Joe, thanks so much for your call. Glad to hear from you listening on The Great Quest. What a wonderful radio station that is. Call to Communion here on EWTN. Still time for your call at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. One of the great podcasts we have cooked up for you on EWTN's Podcast Central is called Rome Boys. You may have heard about Rome Boys. Tony, the theologian, Chris, the entrepreneur, Joe, the farmer. They all get together, they take a topic, and discuss it from their 3 different perspectives. These guys are real, they are bold, and they're very definitely Catholic. You can hear Rome Boys and other faith-filled podcasts at EWTN's Podcast Central. As we mentioned earlier in the program, just go there by visiting EWTN.com/radio. Once you're on the radio homepage, click on the words Podcast Central. Hope you can check that out soon. Those guys are a riot. Let's go to Ellen now, listening in Roswell, Georgia, on The Quest as well. Hello, Ellen. What's on your mind today?
Hi, I have a question. My friend is a Presbyterian, and she made a comment that she won't go to the Catholic Church because we don't let her receive communion. And I said, well, Catholics believe that it's the true body and blood of Jesus Christ. And she said, well, that's what I believe too. And of course, she was able to quote a bunch of stuff from the Bible and everything. So I was wondering, how would a Catholic answer something like that?
Yeah, thanks. I have several things to say about this. The first one is that your friend, I think, is a very poorly catechized Presbyterian. What I mean is that she doesn't know her own tradition well, right? Because for 500 years, most Presbyterians would literally die. Like they would literally die. They would have died the death of martyrdom before they would receive communion in the Catholic Church. And in fact, there were many Reformed Protestants in the 17th century and 18th century who did, in fact, die deaths of martyrdom rather than be forced into Catholic liturgies. And it's one of the subjects that John Calvin, the sort of father of Presbyterian theology, wrote about at length. He wrote a whole treatise against what he called the sin of Nicodemism, which was Reformed or Presbyterian Christians who lived in France and clandestinely worshipped as Presbyterians, but publicly worshipped as Catholics and would go to Catholic churches. And he condemned those people unambiguously as religious hypocrites who were deserving of everything that they got. I mean, so like this, the standard Reformed or Presbyterian position is that the Catholic Mass is a blasphemy, and any Protestant who participates in it basically is anathema and deserves to be excommunicated. So it's astonishing to me to meet a Presbyterian who knows anything about Presbyterianism who would want to go to a Catholic communion. All right, that just blows my mind. All right.
Wow.
So probably doesn't know her own tradition very well. Obviously, I don't agree with those Presbyterians, but that's just historically what they hold. Okay.
Sure.
Secondly, believing in the real presence has absolutely nothing to do with it. It's irrelevant to the question that's being raised. Okay. I believe in the real presence. I'm a Catholic, and I believe in the real presence. Does that give me an unrestricted right to the Eucharist? No. No. I believe everything that the Catholic Church teaches. All of it. The whole kit and caboodle. The whole catechism. Cover to cover. I believe it all. That does not qualify me to go to communion. Does not. Absolutely does not qualify me. Right? If I commit a mortal sin, it doesn't matter that I believe every stitch of the catechism. I am not licitly able to go to communion. I'm disqualified for communion in the Catholic Church, having nothing to do with my belief. Having nothing to do with my belief. Right? Has everything in the world to do with my moral status before God and the Church. Right? How do I get fixed? How do I get that resolved? Well, there's only one way. The Church itself has to declare me clean. In other words, has to absolve me. Right. The Church has to validate that I'm in the proper moral condition. I go to confession, and the Church says, I absolve you. Now, we call it, it's a tribunal, right? It's a judicial act on the part of the Church to validate that I can safely go to communion. Now, St. Paul tells the Church in 1 Corinthians 5, judge people inside the Church, do not judge people outside the Church. This is explicitly what the apostle says. We have no right to judge people that are not Catholics. We judge the heck out of Catholics. Do not judge non-Catholics. A Presbyterian is not a Catholic. And so it is not saying, the Church is not saying, we judge you unworthy. No. We're not making any of that. We're not making that judgment. We're not judging you. The Presbyterian is not under the Church's jurisdiction. The priest has no authority to say to the Presbyterian, you are properly disposed or improperly disposed, because he's not part of the Church. He's not one of the sheep. The priest cannot say that to him. Paul tells us that if we go to communion and we're improperly disposed, that we are not benefiting ourselves. We are, in fact, heaping opprobrium on the name of Jesus, and we're making our spiritual condition worse. It's called a sacrilegious communion, right? Now, a Catholic can be assured of safety from that because I go to confession, the Church absolves me, I can go to communion safely. a Presbyterian who is not within the church's jurisdiction, the church has made no judgment on their spiritual condition, cannot safely go to communion. And we can't safely admit them because we don't know what their situation is. That's consideration number one. So we're not judging them bad. We're just refusing to judge them altogether. Right?
Okay. Yeah.
Here's point number two. When you go to the communion in the Catholic Church, St. Paul tells us that because there's one loaf, we are all one body. Communion is the sacrament of the church's unity. So to commune in the Catholic Church is to affirm liturgically by your action that you believe that this is the one church founded by Jesus to which all people are bound in conscience to obey, and with which I must be in agreement. Paul says, agree on everything. Okay? Now, whatever else may be the case, it is manifestly true that your Presbyterian friend does not believe everything the Catholic Church teaches. If she did, she'd be Catholic.
Yeah.
Right? And so to go to communion in the Catholic Church is to profess by her actions something that she interiorly denies, namely, this is the church founded by Jesus with which I have to be in communion. She doesn't believe that. She doesn't think that. It's irrelevant what she thinks about the real presence. She may believe in the consecrated host. She doesn't believe that Christ subsists in the Catholic Church as such, qua Catholic. She does not believe that, right? She thinks he's every bit as much in the Presbyterian Church as he is the Catholic Church, right? So she doesn't believe the Catholic Church is the thing. And therefore, her communing in the Catholic Church is bearing false witness to what she actually believes. Because our understanding is this signals my total acceptance of Catholicism. She doesn't do that. She's bearing false witness. We don't want her to do that. We don't want her to perjure herself by going to communion.
All right.
Third, the standard Protestant objection to the Catholic Mass has nothing to do with the real presence as such. Well, I won't say nothing, but that's very secondary. That's not the thing they object to. Historically, what Protestants historically object to in Catholicism isn't the real presence. It's the doctrine that the Mass is a sacrifice that we offer to God that's intrinsically meritorious, whereby we can merit our salvation. I have never met the Presbyterian that thinks that. And the day they think it, they're going to get kicked out of the Presbyterian Church. And that is really where the rubber hits the road with respect to source and summit, right? Believing that the Mass is a propitiation of God, that it's a sacrifice that we offer that's meritorious. She does not believe that. And if she does, she's no Presbyterian.
Eileen, thanks so much for your call. We hope that's helpful for you. Let's go to Steve now in the southeast part of our wonderful country, listening on the EWTN app. Hey there, Steve. What's on your mind today?
Oh, yes, hi. I was calling in because I wanted to ask a question about confession and, like, perpetual sin, someone who struggles with a sin and has to confess it frequently. Is there a problem necessarily? I mean, it can get very deep here, but in other words, what should one be doing in that case not to be... The reason I'm bringing this up is I have had some priests sort of scold me and act like I was not really sorry for my sins, as one put it, which I totally am. I mean, I didn't confess in a way that would lead them to believe that I wasn't. I just kind of not sure where I'm at with that. It's sort of creating a little bit of, I don't know what the word to use there, but a little bit of, I guess, displeasure with me in the whole process.
Yeah, thanks. So I have several things to say about. The first one is that it's perfectly acceptable for you to choose a different confessor now. And the day a priest starts expressing displeasure with me for coming to the confessional is the day I find a different confessional. Right? I'm serious. Right? I don't need that. I don't need that in my life. I'm too old. I've been too much garbage to have somebody like poo-poo my however feeble attempts at self-reformation. I'm just not going to put up with that kind of stuff.
That actually happened to me when we lived in Los Angeles. I went to a church I had never been to before, but there was something on my heart. And the priest was so dismissive. He said, "Is that it? Is that, yeah." And you could tell the tone of his voice. He was like, "I got bigger fish to fry." I thought, well, okay, not going back there.
Not going back there. Yeah. So I wouldn't mess with that for 1 second. Secondly, I think it's a bad theology of contrition that imagines that contrition has to come with a particular emotional state. Right. Do I have to rend my garments and pull my hair and weep and cry and gnash my teeth to be contrite? No. And it's possible to have all of those kind of emotions and behaviors and not be contrite. There's just nothing to do with contrition. Contrition is a state of mind. It's a disposition of the will, which is the recognition that I've done wrong and a genuine resolution that I don't want to do it again because it's not in my best interest, eternally or temporally, right?
Yep.
That's all you need, and it can be a totally unemotional affair. Right? It doesn't have to have any emotion attached to it for it to be genuine contrition. The question, if I'm like habitually falling over and over again in the same sin, is it an indication that maybe I'm not sufficiently contrite, or that I'm not making sufficient efforts? Maybe it doesn't indicate that. Perhaps it does, right? And but is that a reason for a priest to become impatient with me? No, because he does it too. I guarantee you he has habitual sins. He has faults. He has weaknesses in his life that he hasn't overcome, right? Because he's not attending to them. And it's not that he despises the mercy or the justice of God or he doesn't want to be holy. It's just that he's got a blind spot. And it's why so much of Jesus' teaching, I think, is oriented towards not giving out moral maxims so much as it is trying to provoke insight into the depths of our moral condition, which is obscure to us many times. Sometimes it does take somebody getting in my face and pointing it out to me. Like, I had somebody point out to me one time that I was behaving in a passive-aggressive manner. And I was like, am not. And like, I really was. I was like kind of pouty and hands in the pockets and kind of brooding. And I was like, oh my gosh, that is what that is, But I didn't see it. I had to have somebody point it out to me. So that can be helpful, all right? But now that I'm aware of it, like I don't do that. Or if I catch myself doing it, I'm like, okay, I'm doing that thing again. I'm not going to be that pouty, broody fellow when I'm in a bad mood,
Yeah.
And so, it's worth asking, what changes could I bring to my schedule, to my system, to my rule of life that would prevent occasions from sin from arising? And what alternate habits could I put in their place? And maybe I'm not doing that process because no one's ever told me to, right? The priest who simply upbraids me and says you're not sufficiently contrite and doesn't actually give me concrete practical advice on how I could change the structure of my life is not really doing me a pastoral favor, because I don't need rebuke. I need insight.
Sure. As do we all. Steve, thanks so much for your call. Here is Deborah now in Michigan, listening online, EWTN.com. Hey, Deborah, what's on your mind today?
Hi, thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
There's a couple in our church. They are not married, but they live together. None of my business. She's Catholic and he's not. And they were going up to communion together until the parish priest told them that he could not receive communion until he took instruction and became a Catholic, and then he'd be welcome to. Well, the issue is that the regular parish priest was out of town with a visiting priest, and this couple, the two of them, went to communion again together. I saw this. I know it's wrong. I know they've been told, and my better judgment says mind your own business, but yet, should I say anything to them or to the priest?
So you're talking about saying it to the pastor when he comes back from out of town? Yeah, well, the question here is, do you want him to sanction them in some way beyond the simple rebuke that he's already given them? And
that is totally not my concern.
Right, exactly. But, I'm trying to think what would be the positive reason to do this. Right? It's like the priest already knows they have this habit, is what you've told me. He's already told them not to do it. So he's not going to change his policy if you say something. The only thing he could do is up the ante a little bit, and go now, or whatever, right? And like you said, that's not your concern. There is a principle of admonishing the sinner in the Catholic tradition, but it's selectively applied with prudence, and the kind of criteria that you bring are: is it likely to help? Is the person likely to listen? Am I the best person to make the admonition, and so forth? And I guess you have to make a real prudent judgment about, what do you think the positive outcome could be to saying something, and what would the negative outcome be? I mean, at the end of the day, what we want is for this couple to be morally regulated in their lives, and what's the best way to bring that about? And it sounds like right now that they're not hearing what the priest is laying down.
Yeah.
And is this going to help? I doubt it.
Well, there you go. Deborah, thanks so much for your call. Couldn't get to Alan in South Carolina or Thomas in Peoria. If you folks would like to stick around, we've got Open Line with Father Gerald Murray coming up next on most of these EWTN stations. If not, then call us back tomorrow. We'll put you at the head of the line. We'll also take care of TK on YouTube, who had a great question regarding wedding bands that priests and nuns wear. I'll be interested in that myself. Dr. David Anders, thank you, sir.
Thanks, Tom.
We do this program Monday through Friday right here on EWTN. Be sure to join us tomorrow at the same time. We would love to have you as a regular listener. On behalf of our fantastic team, I'm Tom Price. We will see you then. God bless.
EWTN Radio Essentials is now EWTN Radio Extra. It's the past, present, and future of Catholic radio. You'll hear classic programs from Mother Angelica and Dr. Scott Hahn, plus timeless devotionals and award-winning podcasts from our partners on EWTN's Podcast Central. Listen now to EWTN Radio Extra on the EWTN app and on EWTN.com.
The way, the truth.
This is EWTN Radio.
Hi, this is Father Gerald Murray. Please join me for Open Line Thursday next on most of these EWTN stations.
Hi, I'm Marcus Peter.
This is Father Mitch Pacwa.
This is Anna Mitchell from the Sunrise Morning Show.
This is John Mark Grodi.
The most trusted Catholic voices are on EWTN Radio.
This is Dr. David Anders. If you missed part of today's show, catch the encore tonight at 11 Eastern or anytime at EWTN Podcast Central. Visit us at EWTN.com/radio/podcasts.
The best way to pray is simply to open our minds and our hearts to God, to allow His presence to begin to fill us, to restore us, to refresh us, to make us new. The best way to pray is simply to be aware of that presence and to say yes to it, to give fiat to that presence as our Blessed Lady did. In that way, we delight in prayer, and God Himself delights in us.